We are live. Hello, everybody, as you're joining the room. So glad to have you here this fine December. I guess this is our holiday. Are there holiday themed questions? I don't think there are in today's webinar, but that is a miss we will have to rectify in coming years. We're thrilled to have you here joining us for our conversation, our sort of year-ender conversation. As always, you're listening in YouTube. You can ask us questions during the show. Post your questions as comments. They will come right into us, and we will get to them at the end of our conversation today. And with that, let us begin. Welcome to Human Solutions, simplifying HR for people who love HR. I'm Pete Wright. The workplace keeps shifting, and in 2025, it feels like it might be shifting faster than ever between federal rollbacks and state-level regulation and the rapid evolution of AI in hiring and management. HR teams are operating in a landscape that requires constant recalibration. And beneath it all, there's a quieter but equally urgent story. Employees are tired. Morale has become the number one priority for employers heading into 2026, surpassing even compensation, and that is a signal. Today, we are sitting down with Tom Jones and Kyle Pardo to talk about the rollback of affirmative action requirements for federal contractors, the evolution of DEI programs under new scrutiny, upcoming changes to Massachusetts state average weekly wage, and what AI regulation might look like as the technology outpaces the law. And we'll dig into what AIM's latest HR practices survey reveals about where employers are focusing their energy and why engagement and morale have moved to the top of the list. Kyle Pardo, Tom Jones, thank you once again for joining this FAIR webinar.
Great to be back.
Thank you, Pete.
Before I answer, or before I ask my first question, I just want to say, as a bit of housekeeping, these webinars, these monthly webinars, have been just a treat, and we are taking a break next month. So you can take a break too. That's right. You get uninterrupted weeks of lunches. You don't have to take a lunch to join us for a webinar in January. We will be back in February after we do our own recalibration. And now, all right, 2025 brought some major state and federal regulatory shifts. Tom, can you kick us off with an overview? Is it possible to give us an overview of what's been going on?
In a short period of time, not really, but
Yeah.
Different things. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal agency on anti-discrimination, has had some of its mandate significantly focused. There's a lot of court cases kicking around the Supreme Court or the federal court system that would limit or alter the powers of federal agencies or the president's role. He would expand his authority to do more with those agencies. It's just Congress, at the same time, Congress and the state legislature don't seem to be doing all that much. The Congress has passed a few different laws, but nothing dramatic or profound. You would think they might have by now with the majorities. State legislature, Massachusetts, has taken almost this whole year to go anywhere. So in some ways, it's hurrying to go nowhere. They're just racing along. It seems to be very active, but they're not doing much. I mean, we went through six weeks of shutdown, and earlier this autumn, so delaying any activity. So it's really hard. If you look at ICE, has become a much more high-profile agency. The Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement. Employers need to be thinking about their I-9s much more. We've been beating that drum a long time lately, saying you've got to be aware of your I-9, make sure they're up to date. At the same time, the executive orders keep rolling out of Washington, out of the White House on new topics. So we have to always be alert. Now, mind you, that's not a law. Executive order is not a law, but it's always something new coming out, some initiative or some limitation on the role of the federal government. So that's some of what's going on. We'll go through a lot of these things as we come across, as we go through the presentation. But over to Kyle.
Yeah, Kyle, when you look at the your perspective on the long arc of the last year, what do you think is going to have the most significant long-term impact on our employers?
I don't know about long-term, short-term I-9s. This has been a hot topic for employers all of this year, as Tom mentioned, with ICE and in organizations really thinking about taking a look at their I-9. So I think that's a current hot topic. Longer term, DEI, I think we'll see where that evolves, and I think we'll probably talk about AI. So AI legislation has been introduced, and we don't know what that looks like yet. Introduced means it hasn't been finalized or anything, but yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what regulations come around AI and how that's impacting the HR landscape.
Well, so much of what I think what will echo through this conversation is the friction that exists between state legislation and federal action, and it seems to be more of it than ever, and especially maybe in Massachusetts, which tends to be a real bellwether for state action. So let's start with affirmative action and DEI. Tom, you kicked us off with the big two words from the administration: executive orders, some of which directly impact our employers. Where would you like to start?
Boy, it's hard to say for sure. One thing, January 21st. So the president gets sworn in January 20th. January 21st, an executive order comes out repealing the affirmative action order, 11246, and saying by April it no longer operates. And there's a couple of exceptions to that, dealing with veterans and dealing with some limitations for disability. But for the most part, that executive order wiped out all the affirmative action programs. And employers have to adjust to that. Some may keep some form of affirmative action program, but if you're a federal contractor, the government may put you under heightened scrutiny as to whether you should continue to operate with a plan like that. So it's a work in progress, but definitely that's one of the major steps on affirmative action. DEI is the next one, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was, I think, 2 more executive orders that came out late January 2025 that would basically call into question any employer's diversity program if they were a federal contractor. First off, the federal government eliminated their own diversity efforts at the different federal agencies. And that sort of sent a message out there to the wider employer community that if you have a diversity program, you're going to be under heightened scrutiny. And you saw that happen with different law firms over the course of the early part of the year. So I think a lot of companies are going to be taking a step back or taking a pause and saying, what, if anything, should we be doing to change our diversity efforts? And that's going to continue to be an issue throughout the next few years of the administration.
I kind of can't believe this was January of 2025. It seems like years have passed since January of 2025. I'm curious both of your perspectives on the implications. Like you say, employers are going to be stepping back, but the last 11 months have in this area in particular have been, I think, is it generous to say, confusing?
Yes.
Kyle, what have you been seeing?
Yeah, so there's 2 different pieces. So with affirmative action plans, there's employers who are still trying to figure out, like, what do they have to track, if anything. And as Tom mentioned, there's still some components of it that are in place. But bigger than that, employers are taking a whole different look, I think, at what DEI in kind of the traditional sense may look like. So we ask in our survey every year, what are your top priorities for next year? In 2024, DEI was the top priority. The end of heading into 2025, it fell off the list. So already before we even got to January, DEI was already kind of not quite a top priority. Having said that, there have been several surveys done, studies done, where close to 100% of employers and employees are saying, employees really want to feel valued and seen in the workplace. And so I think what we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see, is a shift away from kind of what we've thought of as DEI, more of a focus on inclusion, and inclusion really broadening that definition of DEI, where we've been looking at it as race and gender, but really thinking of it more now as disability and veteran status and LGBTQ. And so really kind of taking a broader lens at it, because we'll talk about this more, but employees are really looking at how are they being welcomed into the workplace. And so I think employers understand they can't fully go away from, affirmative action. They really need to kind of think about it in a broader lens.
Did it surprise you how quickly that turned after January?
In some ways, yes. Though, if you look back, there's this whole book called Plan 2025 or something like that that had been drafted while the Trump administration was out of office.
Project 2025.
Project 2025, yes. So once they came in beginning in November, once they knew they were going to be elected, then I think they went back through that project. If you read it over, it's pretty clear that they're very bright lines as to what they were going to try and do on, we paid most attention to labor and employment side at AIM, but looking at different programs, what they could change. So I think they had the executive orders pretty well in hand. And it's almost like the fire hose of information came out at employers. And the question for a lot of them is, how much do we have to actually do? And that, Kyle's point, taking a pause and thinking through how much work do we actually have to do to comply with it? Do we have to comply with it? Can we continue to do what we're doing normally? What's the risk? And so that put a lot of companies in almost the back foot a little bit.
And I think the employers too, who were receiving federal grants or other funding, were the ones too who were being a little bit more cautious and trying to think about, like, okay, how do we continue to support our employees, and how do we continue to value what we value, but not risk losing some of that funding?
I know there's, I can sort of see the future, and there is a question that is going to come up, so I'll just get it out right now. If a company isn't or doesn't have any federal contractors, do these executive orders affect them at all? Does it affect them implicitly? Does it affect them culturally? What do you see?
Culturally, perhaps. I mean, if you don't, they're only a proclamation by a president, executive orders. They've been going on forever. But they're just a proclamation, so he is typically limited in the scope as to what they can do. Like Kyle said, federally funded programs, yes. You're getting money from the federal as a contractor, as a grant recipient, or whatever it might be. Yes, that's going to impact you. But for a company that makes widgets in Central Massachusetts, has 50 employees there, and has no federal contracts, they sell to the private market. They're pretty much untouched by this legally. Now, whether culturally or whether they want to do something about it or morally or whatever is a whole different story. But I think legally they're pretty much beyond the scope of it.
And I'll just use another example, which is that there's an executive order that recognized only two genders. And
Yes.
so, so if it's a federally regulated health insurance plan, for example, an ERISA plan, that may change how reporting is done in that sense. It doesn't mean that an employer can't still recognize, other genders or how that's done in the
Fluidity
workplace.
of genders, yeah.
Right. It's it might just be kind of on a federal reporting piece. So that would be different.
I know we're going to come back to some questions that relate to this, but let's move on to our next big topic. This one for Tom, the state average weekly wage.
Right.
What is SAW, and why do we need to be thinking about it?
Well, the SAW is the basis for three different major programs here in the state. One of them is unemployment insurance. Another one is workers' compensation. The third is the paid family medical leave. Basically, as the SAW adjusts every year, and it goes up, it never goes down. All of those benefits attached to those increase, putting cost on the system. For example, our unemployment. So let me back up a minute. The SAW right now is $1,922 for the new year. Workers' compensation, the maximum benefit is 100% of that. Paid family leave, the maximum benefit is 64% of that. Unemployment, the maximum benefit is 50% of that. Now, in 2000, I went back and looked. In the year 2000, 25 years ago, the state average weekly wage was $600. So it's more than tripled in the space of 25 years. And that's a factor in cost for companies. Obviously, the more, the faster it grows, the more benefits increase. The more benefits increase, the more the charges levied on employers to pay for it increase. So we wanted to just make sure people were aware of the SAW. I know it's probably going to help bankrupt the UI system in the next couple of years here in Massachusetts, and it ends up causing us to have the highest benefits in the country in unemployment insurance. And that just is a driving factor. And just wanted to make sure people were aware of what that would mean.
I feel like we also need to do a vibe check on this, however, Tom, because, there are intended and unintended consequences of this number in particular. And,
Yeah.
at what point do you see smaller employers saying, I think we might have to cap our benefits because costs are getting out of control?
Well, they might. I mean, they have other benefits they could offer. If these three become so expensive because of the SAW increase, the potential exists to have to trim other benefits, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, Kyle may see that in the surveys that we do. I don't know if you're going to see that at all, but you think of things like health insurance or other more elective benefits. Perhaps it could have an adverse impact on it, as these costs continue to go up.
Okay, that's the SAW.
Yep.
We can move on from the SAW. It's a good update, and thank you for that. We'll have some links so if you want to read more about the SAW. Let us move to AI, to our robot overlords. Things have changed a lot. We've done a number of conversations, taken a number of questions about AI over the last several years on this platform. What are you seeing, and what should Massachusetts employees expect as AI continues to develop? Tom, you got a quick one off the dome?
Sure. I mean, I think you're going to see some disruption and displacement in the workplace. People are going to have to get retrained to ways to use AI. Companies are going to have to, and it won't necessarily mean getting rid of employees. It'll rather mean that you used to do A, B, and C. Now you're going to have to do A, B, C, D, E in order to implement use AI more successfully.
Because ideally, D and E, C, D, and E, you'll be able to do much faster.
Correct.
That's the proposed.
And it'll enhance productivity and do that. And in some cases, that may mean people getting dismissed from their jobs because they're redundant or no longer necessary in that position. But the overall goal, as you would hope, would be to improve efficiency, improve productivity, and not to see it used as a tool to get rid of people across the board. But there's a transition period in which people aren't quite sure where things are going at the moment.
Well, that's part of the question of friction that we're talking about, right, between the state and the federal. But before we dig into that, I'm curious, Kyle, from the HR practices survey, what are you seeing from our employers? How is HR using or responding to AI in the workplace right now?
So it's interesting. I actually went back and I listened to a podcast that the three of us did in the beginning of 2024. So almost 2 years ago. And at that point, we were smart enough to say, I think we're going to be using it more and more, right? We kind of knew that 2 years ago. So at that point, the survey results said that 8% of employers were using AI in HR. So last year, that number went up to 14%. And this year it's up to 26%. So 3 times where we were 2 years ago. So still, only a quarter of employers, but I think, I'm going to make the prediction now when we look at it again a year, that's going to be exponential. I just think it's going to keep increasing. And we asked employers, how are you using it in HR? And number one is in recruitment. So applicant tracking systems. I continue to be really optimistic about AI and how it can be used to get rid of those repetitive tasks. But I still just urge caution, just from a compliance standpoint. Applicant tracking systems can be great. They can learn your preferences, see what the types of people you like to hire for your organization. But really, double checking with vendors, making sure that these systems don't have a bias in it that's going to, cause further discrimination or in that sense. But recruiting is number one. The second most used area is onboarding. So people developing kind of onboarding modules for their employees. Some of them are interactive. So you're sitting there, you kind of conversing with the chatbot, and the chatbot's, teaching you about the company and about your benefits and about, where you access different things in the organization. So people are using it that way. The third one is understanding your compensation and benefits. So, those areas can be challenging sometimes for people to understand. Think of benefits, what's covered, what's not covered. So using AI for that. And then the fourth one is for learning and development. So different types of training modules. But again, the caution I've said before, and I'll keep saying it, is there's room for error, right? And so if you're using AI to tell people about their employee benefits or about onboarding, what errors could come up? Could they tell you you're covered for surgery and you're not? So, I think it's great. I think we'll continue to use it for these everyday types of tasks, but use some caution there.
It's interesting, Pete.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry to interrupt. There's
Sure.
a case that came up in Massachusetts recently in which a company was alleged to have used AI, kind of like in Massachusetts, it's illegal to use a lie detector as part of the hiring process. So this case evolved on whether using the AI robot was the equivalent of using a lie detector and determining whether or not that applicant was telling the truth. And so litigations come out of that. The most recent case, the case was dismissed because the court said no, it didn't have sufficient evidence. But we'll see cases like those come up
Sure.
as people don't get jobs, as people begin to question, or someone says, you can imagine a scenario. Someone in HR says, "Well, we didn't hire you because the robot said you were, untruthful," and it just creates litigation, has the potential for doing it. And so there's a lot of worry about discrimination as well for the same reason.
Yeah, I'll tell you what's on my mind about this, because it has changed over the last 2 years, as you can imagine, especially when it comes to recruiting, because we have seen people who have been let go of their jobs for one reason or another stay on the job market longer than anyone would ever have expected, right? They are hunting and hunting and hunting for work. What they are seeing is they're getting no responses from potential employers at all, and hearing that employers are using these recruiting systems and with AI built in to filter out people they want to talk to and not even respond to those they don't want to talk to. And as a response to this, job seekers are using AI to create variants of resumes and cover letters and submit in numbers never ever seen before, sending hundreds of applications a week to jobs that are getting thousands and thousands of people. So we've essentially built our own sort of mutually assured destruction in the hiring process. Can you comment on this sort of cognitive dissonance? What have we done to ourselves for actually finding the really great people and keeping them?
It's so funny that you bring that up, because one of the complaints that was brought up in the surveys, people talked about the challenges with hiring and finding the right people. And one of them is getting people to respond. And so HR people are frustrated that applicants aren't responding. Applicants are frustrated because HR people aren't responding.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's almost information overload in some instances. There's so many people applying for jobs that HR people are overwhelmed and trying to sort through, because again, we go back to the kind of the old days of we had to write the letter and you had to put the stamp on it and get in the mail. You're really thoughtful about where you applied and that process.
There was friction, and that was beneficial, right?
Yeah. And
Right.
so I think the same thing. I think applicants are applying to so many things. Sometimes they forget where they applied. So HR people, reach out and then the applicant doesn't respond. So it's becoming a little bit of a crazy loop with the recruitment process.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that I bring this up noting we don't have an answer for it, I don't think.
No.
Maybe it's too soon. Maybe it doesn't exist. But we should be talking about it, because it's damaging for both parties to be in this kind of information overload. We're not doing something right.
Yeah. And you can get a rejection letter now, within minutes of applying.
Yeah.
Right. If your criteria on your resume doesn't quite meet the expectations, you can get that rejection letter pretty quickly.
Well, blessing be to those who are sending rejection letters at all, because that's really gracious. Just send something. Note to self, you were heard.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, that actually leads us to our final big question, the biggest trend that we talked about in our introduction here: morale and engagement. What is going on with morale as the number one trend right now? What are our top priorities?
Yeah. So we ask this question every year, and four of your top 5 priorities, there are 4 topics that have come up every year for the last 8 years: compliance, compensation, recruiting and retention, and safety. So those 4 have switched places in the top 5 for the last 8 years.
Wow.
Morale and engagement just came on the scene last year as number 5, and this year it's jumped up to number 1. So this is really, I think it's interesting. It's right. This is brand new, and I think everyone has a lot going on. We're 5 years post COVID, but I think there's some remnants of that, and there's people who are kind of struggling to pay the bills. I think there's people who are working a couple of jobs, so there's some burnout and stress. I think there are some, I'm going to call them HR adjacent factors, which are things like transportation and childcare and housing, and lots of pressures on people in general. And so then they're coming to the workplace and thinking like, I need my employer to support me. I need to be in an environment where, there's people who uplift me and I'm feeling engaged in doing something meaningful. So I think it's really interesting that this is kind of catapulted to the number 1 priority for this year.
Well, it's really interesting when you look at it in the context of the shift away from compensation as a top focus, because all of the things that you're talking about with regard to the stresses of 2025, 2026 living seem to be related to an affordability crisis that we're dealing with. And if compensation were able to address some of those things, and we could afford transportation and childcare and healthcare, would that lead to a change in morale? Or is there something else leading to this crisis? It gets us right back to the DEI question from the beginning. When we stop feeling heard, is that the direct line to the morale issues?
I absolutely think so, and I do think money helps, right? Of course, people love a good bump in their paycheck, but there's some parts of that. There's caregiving. With the Sanders generation, there are many people who are caring for their kids and their parents at the same time, and that doesn't get resolved quickly with a change in your paycheck. There are mental health issues. There's and so I think employers are trying to figure out how do we have a culture where people want to be every day, and so another piece kind of added into this that we saw in the survey is the return to in-person work. And so last year there were I think it was only 39% of companies that required in-person work. This year was 50%. So we're seeing the return to the workplace happen, and employers thinking, I think part of that is, we can be better at developing our culture, and when we physically can see other people, not just from a remote environment. So I think people and leaders are aware of these challenges in the culture and engagement piece, but I think we'll continue to see that in the next couple of years as well.
We talk about all the other survey responses. I think this hybrid work thing is a significant one and represents potentially a leadership employee rift that we should also probably be talking about, right? I think I'm curious your perspectives on the word mandate at work, the in-person, the return to work mandate, and its direct impact on morale. Am I reading too much into it?
No, I mean, there's a couple of different camps on it, right? There are people who I said that in person is important because of the culture, because of trust issues. People saying, if I need to see you working to know that you're working. So focusing on the input rather than the output. Right. So there are some organizations who say, as long as you get the reports to me at the end of the month, I'm good. I don't care where you do it. I'm okay with it. And other people say, I really need to see you putting in your time to know that it's getting done. Maybe some people are justifying the office space, so they want people back in. But we all got used to the remote work, and so the mandate, that word you're using, people say well, why do I have to be back there? And I think when we talk about kind of those HR adjacent functions, some people moved further away from work during COVID because it was less expensive to live outside of a city rather than maybe in a city, and so you move further away. So now when you have this mandate to return to work, you have a longer commute or more expensive commute, and so
Right.
those are the types of things I think that impact overall morale.
And sometimes
Compliance
people moved
and-
away with the company's permission.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And now the company has to turn around and mandate,
Right.
Yeah.
rescind it. Right.
Yeah.
Are there compliance or legislative factors that are influencing morale issues, Tom? What do you see?
Well, it's funny. We have a government affairs department here at AIM, and I spoke to one of our people in that department yesterday. He said, interestingly enough, he anticipates a White House executive order coming in that would ban states from regulating AI. Over the course of at least the
Yeah.
Trump administration. I don't know how much that will happen or not, but it's really that they're trying to centralize it so there's one standard. So that may have some blowback for different companies as well and for different employees, depending on what the regulations are, if there are any that come out of it.
Sure.
It's, the leave laws. Massachusetts has pretty solid number of leave laws that are very popular with employees. In fact, sometimes to the consternation of HR and to different companies. They're struggling with it, but other proposals, seeing one out there in bereavement leave that would make it mandatory. It's about the only leave left in Massachusetts, I think, that we don't have mandatory.
In terms of
And
your
I think-
leave bingo card, the Massachusetts leave
Mhm.
bingo
Right.
card. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think there's a law in Oregon that would make it mandatory.
I've
That makes
heard
it
that
mandatory.
swimming
Yeah.
around. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's probably one that's kicking around. Not
All right.
too much else at the moment that would, a lot of stuff seems to be not very fluidly, not necessarily going anywhere, but
Mhm.
that are being kicked around and considered by different organizations.
Sure. Well, that seems to be the word of the conversation today: is watch for these areas of friction between state and federal, and keep an eye on that morale. That's a big surprise. It's a surprise, not surprising,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
thank you both, Kyle Pardo, Tom Jones. Thank you both for hanging out with me today, for sure.
Yeah.
I so appreciate these conversations. I hope these are appreciated by those who are listening. Thank you, everybody who are dining and webinaring with us today. We appreciate your time and your attention. Don't forget, we've got show notes. Look at those show notes for any resources that we've talked about. We'll put some links to the resources that will help you feel better engaged in this time of great change. You can also listen to the show right there on aimhrsolutions.com. But also subscribe to Human Solutions wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, you can find the show and listen to a replay of these webinars and find our entire catalog, our entire history. While we're taking a break in January, there are dozens and dozens of past episodes that you can listen to. We're totally binge-worthy. How about that? We're totally binge-worthy. On behalf of Tom Jones and Kyle Pardo, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next year right here on Human Solutions.